So I'm really excited to be here. I'm excited for two reasons. First of all, I have nothing controversial really to bring up today. So thank you very much. And the second thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about the roots a little bit. And I'm going to use Jay as an example. And of course, all the root servers, we all don't speak on the behalf of any other roots. But I definitely want to let you know about some of the things that are going on with a couple of our instances. As you know, VeriSign has two roots. One's a.root-servers.net, and that is a unicast instance, and the other one is jroot, which is anycast. So what I like to do is I like to first of all go through the history of jroot. As many of you know, it's gone through a number of changes over the last couple of years. Notably, it's had an IP address change, and it's also gone from unicast to anycast, and some other interesting things as we found as a result of doing this. So here you can see our historical query volume since February of 2001, and the stuff that's in the purple there to the left is when it was a unicast address, and during that time frame, in November 5, 2002, it's kind of where that dip is right there, is where the IP address changed from the old to the new. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. And then the anycast instance, which started on March 17th of 2003. And as you can see, all those colors to the right there are all different instances of J. So here's a kind of a drill down on the anycast instances. And you can see as we bring new boxes up, what's interesting about this is they seem to eat their young. So if, for example, if you look at the far right, there's a new instance that was brought up in Korea, and it's in red. And you can see that total traffic had not really changed that much, but it decreased the traffic to a number of the other anycast instances. And this graph kind of actually shows us a little bit better, where you can see that off to the right in September of 2004, that many of the other anycast instances actually dropped their total aggregate traffic, whereas when the new instance came along, it kind of took over. So now we're going to flip a little bit and talk about jroot and when it's changed its IP address. And as you can see, the new IP address took off and increased in traffic, which is expected. But what's interesting here is the green line. And the green line is the old IP address. And what's interesting about this is whenever you have a root server, you kind of have a disease that lasts a lifetime. And so as long as that IP address is exposed on the internet, it's going to get DNS traffic. And we're going to talk about what types of DNS traffic it actually sees here in a moment. And here's a drill down a little bit closer about the actual change of the IP address. The address was actually announced on November 5 of 2002, and you can see that traffic in that afternoon, that afternoon zone cut release, and you can see that traffic actually increased to the point where a couple days later it actually overtook the old instance with the new traffic, with the new IP address rather. So why does the old jroot still have traffic? So what we did is we took a week's worth of source IP addresses, which is actually fairly recent, and for each 24-hour period, we actually took out addresses that were probably priming queries. And so we took those that queried the jroot at least 3 times. And when we subtracted those out, it took out about 70 to 100,000 IPs per day. And that left us an aggregate a little over 200,000 unique IP addresses. And we wanted to see what was going on. So what we did is we took this really cool fingerprinting software that Roy Ahrens wrote, FPDNS, and tried to fingerprint all of those IP addresses. And as expected, a large number of them were unreachable because of firewalls and other sorts of things. Actually, internally, we call them IWPs. So idiots with firewalls. So, but the ones that we could find reachable, we found that there was 141 different signatures associated with them. And the results are actually somewhat surprising. As you can see, a large number of the actual traffic instances are very recent versions of bind. And this kind of dispels one of the rumors that priming, which was broken in earlier versions, basically priming is getting the NS set for dot. It seems to be, maybe there's more to it than this, than what we see right now. So what's going on? Well, we really don't know. And so we really need to look at this a little bit more closely, and we need to have a new theory. Because this sort of traffic really theoretically ought to go down and hopefully someday just go away. But as you can see, it does not. So now let's talk a little bit about the J's anycast structure. Each site is globally visible behind AS62, 26415. And it's all of those are global. All instances are globally visible to anyone else. Now, other routes have different policies. Some of them have sort of local anycast instances. Some of them have actually anycast within their own network and so on. But we have a global view, which is kind of interesting. In the local topology, so that we have a good understanding of what we're measuring here, is that we have multiple boxes behind that are answering behind load balancers, and we have monitoring boxes that are out in front of those load balancers, so you get a total view of the traffic. And one of the things that we did is we decided to take two 24-hour snapshots during the week. Mondays are always heavy days because that's when everybody comes back to work and starts using their boxes again. So we decided to use midweek traffic, both the Tuesday and Thursday instance, and try to figure out what kind of systems are looking at these boxes. And what we did is we did a couple of fun things. One is we looked at geomapping, mapped the IP address to geographic location. We also looked at what types of systems are hitting those boxes and what sorts of systems are actually asking for invalid TODs and other sorts of interesting behaviors that I'll get into. So what we did is we took some commercially available software and actually mapped the IP addresses that we've received in those two 24-hour traces and actually mapped it to the physical location. And the colors that I'm going to show in the maps following this, the brighter the color, the more sorts of queries that we receive from that particular IP address. So here we have our first server, which is based in Dulles. And what's interesting about this is it has, of course, a lot of US traffic, but also has a lot of traffic in Germany. And what's interesting about this box is it's actually a box that's co-located in AOL's facility, and they have a large presence in Germany. And actually this actually shows through here. Now here's another box, which is in Los Angeles. And this traffic actually changes quite a bit in terms of it sees a lot on the West Coast, but it also sees a lot in Japan. So it's very close to a peering point that deals a lot with Japan, so that seems to make sense, as well as Australia. Here's another box that's in Mountain View. And again, most of the traffic, well, unlike the other ones, it has a much more sort of continental US sort of flavor to it. And here's a box in Amsterdam. And what's interesting about this is in Europe, obviously, is very much congregated there, and as well as the eastern side of the United States, as well as other places like South America actually shows up as well. And London as well, very similar to Amsterdam. And finally, here's Atlanta. And you can see that, again, there's quite a sort of locality of reference in dealing with these servers and the amount of traffic it receives from those particular sites. And I guess there's one more, Singapore. And what's interesting about this is it's focused a lot on Asia. So what does this all mean? Well, one of the things that people always kind of like this eye candy. But it used to be that there was this mantra that was spoken here, and that is location did not equal topology. And that was because everybody connected to the United States because their interconnect costs between the countries were so high. And as we all know, this is changing quite a bit. And location is actually starting to become more aligned with topology. So another interesting thing that we did as part of this project is we collected the TTLs on the IP packets. And this gives you kind of a rough correlation. And I'm talking really rough. This is not, something you can feel really definitive on the correlation of the OS that sent that particular packet. And if the TTL is less than 30, it was typically an AIX box. Less than 64, a Linux or BSD box. Less than 128, a Windows box. And less than 255, a Solaris or Cisco or HP box. So as we looked at this, we said, okay, give all these IP addresses, let's map these queries by OS group. And it's fairly expected to see the sort of behavior you have here. Linux, Windows, and Solaris have a large share. But one of the things that was kind of surprising about this is we always looked at, hey, who's creating all this pollution at the roots in terms of sending all these invalid queries? And many of us, I was somewhat surprised in that Linux had such a high number here, and that Windows had a significantly smaller portion. So I found that to be somewhat surprising. So now another thing that we did is we looked at sites that were seen, at IP addresses that were seen at 2 or more Anycast sites during these tests. And we found that almost 3.7% of all the traffic was seen at 2 or more sites. And this turned out to be a little bit more than I expected. And at that point, we decided to look at a couple examples. So these graphs are a little bit small, but hopefully you can kind of get the sense here of what's going on. The one to the left has kind of normal oscillation, where it goes to one site and then it shifts to another, and back to the initial site, and so on and so forth. But the one to the right is somewhat worrisome to me, because it has somewhat of an abnormal sort of jitter. And you can see that 2 or more sites were actually getting traffic at approximately the same time. And this I was somewhat surprised about. Most of our findings have so far been found at somewhat far-flung sites, places that are not close to what we consider the core of the internet today. But they are, again, a part of this whole sort of community, so we need to service them as well. So the take-home of this is that we expected to see some sort of sawtooth distribution if you saw 2 or more IPs at 2 or more locations. But we have a noisy distribution in some of these cases. And this, of course, does not affect UDP, but it does affect anything with stateful transport. And maybe there are some things that actually are taken care of by not running, by running sort of local Anycast instances. But we need to look at this as root server operators to see what's really going on. So I found that to be fairly interesting. Obviously, I have an older version of the talk here, but this is actually another sort of another sort of view on J coming online in Japan, where given the 2 sort of aggregate days we have, you can see that when J came online, it did not affect the total overall traffic too much, and it shows that the routes have quite a bit of headroom, so that if they didn't have headroom, what you would see is an increase in traffic because there was some amount that was actually sort of buffered or not serviced by someone else. So, conclusions. Well, I think I gave Susan a heart attack in getting this ready because I was so late. And that, in consequence, there's been a little work done with others, and we're actually reaching out for others to do that. This has been fairly interesting to some of the routing people I've dealt with, and they've actually been working hard on trying to figure out what's going on within the core. We need to look at the retired JRoot IP address and try to figure out why is this continuous steady stream of traffic occurring. and try to figure out ways to alleviate that. And finally, on Anycast, there are multiple ways of dealing with Anycast, and are there better ways than others? This is something that we need to look at. And given how the roots are, one of our mantras is diversity is good, but is diversity worth having some suboptimal sort of configurations? And finally, as dealing with these suboptimal configurations, if that in fact is the case, the influence on IPv6 and DNSSEC and a whole bunch of other things that actually are going to be put into DNS, which affect the packet size, that actually sort of escalate into stateful transport, how is that going to affect these people that are actually dealing with this oscillation that we saw a little bit earlier? So with that, that concludes my presentation. And are there any questions? Uh-oh.
Very little work done with others. So Kata does some work on DNS. Would you like to make your data available to the research community so we could study it?
We will certainly work with you on that.
Okay, I've heard that before.
Oh, I've been working with some others. So I guess we need to talk about that, Casey. Great.
Any other questions? Okay.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.